Dry Creek Valley, Oregon, 1889. For 3 years, nobody had wanted the 70 acres behind that broken fence. Then one morning, a young widow walked up to the rusted for sale sign, studied the ruined ranch for several minutes, and quietly decided she would buy it. The people watching from the road thought she had lost her mind. The Brennan Ranch had been abandoned since Tom Brennan died during a bitter February. His children lived far away and wanted nothing to do with a property that required money, work, and memories. The house was collapsing, the barn had lost most of its roof. The fences sagged across the fields. 6 apple trees along the northern boundary had grown wild, their branches twisting toward the sky. Old tools lay scattered in the yard, slowly disappearing beneath rust and dust. Yet Adelaide Hartley saw something nobody else could see. She saw a beginning. Adelaide was 31, recently widowed, and carrying almost everything she owned in one battered trunk. 6 months earlier she had left Boston after losing the husband she adored. Edward Hartley had been a schoolteacher, a thoughtful man who respected Adelaide's intelligence and encouraged her dreams. Their marriage had lasted only 14 months. First they lost their infant son. Then pneumonia took Edward before Adelaide had even learned how to live with the first grief. His life insurance money was enough to survive for a while, but it could not give her back the future she had imagined. She traveled west with Edward's books packed inside her trunk, searching for somewhere she could begin again without being treated like a helpless widow. Dry Creek was supposed to be temporary. Instead, she stayed. For weeks, Adelaide walked across the valley, studying the soil, the creek, the hills, and the abandoned ranch. She filled a notebook with measurements, calculations, and plans. She figured out what could be repaired and what would need replacing. Then she bought the Brennan property for the asking price. The town expected her to last perhaps 3 months. Some thought she would leave before summer. Others believed she was simply desperate. Adelaide proved them wrong before the first month ended. The house had no reliable stove, so she repaired the damaged chimney herself. The well was clogged, so she cleaned it until clear water returned. She removed rotten floorboards, patched openings in the roof, and cleared debris from the yard. She worked from dawn until darkness, often eating simple meals while standing over Edward's books. When her hands blistered, she wrapped them in cloth and continued. Her first major project was the fence. Without a strong fence, everything else would eventually fail. One afternoon, an elderly doctor watched her driving a post into hard ground. "That's men's work," he told her. Adelaide wiped the sweat from her face and answered calmly, "It's necessary work." "I don't believe work knows whether a man or woman is holding the tool." The doctor had no answer. By the end of spring, the fence stood again. By summer, Adelaide had planted a garden, bought 3 chickens, and begun turning the abandoned property into a working ranch. She wasn't rebuilding a home. She was rebuilding a life. The summer heat nearly destroyed everything Adelaide Hartley had accomplished. The creek became little more than a narrow ribbon of water. The ground cracked beneath the sun, and every plant seemed to fight for survival. Adelaide responded by digging channels that redirected water toward her garden. She worked early in the morning and late in the evening, resting during the hottest hours. Somehow, the garden survived. The chickens survived. The fence survived. And Adelaide kept going. Then winter arrived. In December, a violent storm swept through Dry Creek Valley. For 3 days, freezing wind screamed across the ranch. Snow buried the fields, 2 sections of Adelaide's fence collapsed, and the barn roof she had worked so hard to repair was damaged again. The garden was destroyed. Adelaide spent nights trapped in the barn with 2 blankets and a candle, listening to the storm pound against the walls. For the first time, she wondered whether the land had finally defeated her. When the storm ended, she walked outside and stared at the broken fence. She had built every section with her own hands. Now many of those posts lay scattered beneath the snow. Adelaide stood silently, wondering if she had mistaken stubbornness for courage. Then she heard wagon wheels. Tom Harris, the owner of the local feed store, had driven out as soon as the road became passable. He climbed from his wagon, pulled out a post-hole digger and several new fence posts, and placed them beside her. "Brought some extra," he said. He didn't ask whether she needed help. He simply picked up a tool. Adelaide looked at him, then at the ruined fence. That afternoon, she began rebuilding. Tom worked beside her. Before sunset, Kate Moretti arrived with hot soup and 2 more people willing to help. Something changed that day. Adelaide had spent months believing she had to carry everything alone. The storm showed her that sometimes people were waiting for an invitation they didn't know how to ask for. By spring, the ranch looked different. The fence was stronger than before. The barn roof held. The garden returned. The rusty equipment had been cleaned and repaired until some of it became useful again. The town began noticing. Tom started quietly reducing the price of Adelaide's supplies. Kate began exchanging jars of preserves for fresh eggs. The church women, who once questioned an unmarried woman living alone, stopped treating Adelaide as someone who needed to fit into their expectations. Adelaide was simply Adelaide. Then, late in January of her 2nd year, she posted a notice outside the general store: work available, carpentry, fencing, repair, general labor. 3 men came the following Monday. Among them was Samuel Garrett, a former homesteader who had lost his own land during a drought. Adelaide showed them everything she had planned. She offered fair wages and expected serious work. Samuel asked one important question: "Are you planning to sell when this place becomes valuable?" Adelaide looked across the fields. "No," she said. "I intend to be buried here." Samuel nodded. He stayed. So did the others. Soon Adelaide had 4 permanent workers. The abandoned Brennan Ranch was no longer a forgotten failure. It was becoming something the entire valley could believe in. And Adelaide wasn't finished by summer. People from neighboring farms were driving out simply to see what Adelaide Hartley had done. The 70 acres that once looked like a warning had become a place filled with movement, repaired buildings, growing crops, working animals, and men earning honest wages. But Adelaide had begun thinking beyond her own property. She had learned something during those difficult years. Rebuilding one broken place could give other people the courage to rebuild theirs. The first request came from the church women. Their kitchen had been falling apart for years. The stove was damaged, shelves were collapsing, and one section of the floor had been covered by an old rug because nobody remembered why it was there. They had asked for donations again and again, but there was never enough money. One afternoon, they approached Adelaide nervously. "Could you repair it?" they asked. Adelaide walked through the kitchen, examined every wall, shelf, and floorboard, then opened her notebook. She calculated the materials and labor. "I'll do it at cost," she said. For 6 weeks, Adelaide and her crew worked on the church kitchen. They replaced the damaged flooring, repaired the walls, rebuilt the shelves, and installed a solid stove. When they finally removed the old rug, they discovered that the floor beneath it was perfectly good. Someone had covered it years earlier for a reason nobody remembered, and the covering had simply remained. When the church women saw the finished kitchen, several of them cried. It wasn't merely a renovated room. To them, it was proof that something neglected could still become beautiful. Word spread through Dry Creek. Soon Adelaide was repairing fences for struggling farmers, rebuilding sheds, teaching people how to improve irrigation, and hiring workers who had once been unable to find steady employment. She never treated anyone as charity. If someone needed work, she found useful work. If someone needed knowledge, she shared what she had learned. If someone had lost hope, she showed them what persistence looked like. The ranch itself became a symbol. Children visited to see the orchard. Families came to admire the garden. Farmers stopped to study Adelaide's water channels. Men who once laughed at the idea of a woman running 70 acres now asked her advice. 2 years after she bought the land, the town held a gathering near the ranch. Adelaide expected a simple community meeting. Instead, she found nearly everyone from Dry Creek standing there. Tom Harris stepped forward first. He spoke about the woman who had arrived with one trunk and purchased the worst property in the valley. Kate spoke about the church kitchen. Samuel spoke about finding work when he believed his useful years were finished. Then an old farmer who had doubted Adelaide from the beginning removed his hat and said, "We thought you were trying to save this ranch. We were wrong. You were teaching all of us that broken things aren't necessarily finished?" Adelaide could not answer. She looked toward the 6 apple trees that had once stood wild and forgotten. Now they were pruned, healthy, and beginning to bear fruit. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about Edward, their little boy, and the life she had lost. The grief was still there, but it no longer owned her. She had built something that death could not erase. As the sun dropped behind the golden hills, the entire town stood together on the land everyone had once abandoned. And Adelaide finally understood what she had really built. It wasn't just a ranch. It was a place where people learned that hope could grow again. This is Wild West Tales Stories, where every forgotten place has a story. And sometimes the strongest people are the ones who refuse to walk away.